So this is our final video, and this video is concerning Britain in the 21st century. 21st century Britain was affected by many events from around the world, and there were new problems and new attitudes. So the 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Towers meant that the world now faced a new kind of threat from terrorism. And this in turn led to nations focusing on developing ways to protect themselves from terrorist attacks. A newfound suspicion was evident to foreigners and people with ethnic minority backgrounds. This is despite Britain opening up after World War II in order to boost immigration and production. And it was under this blanket of unease that the UK decided to host the 2012 Summer Olympics in London. So the Olympics is a highly sought after event for any country, as it gives prestige, and the revenue generated can be pretty large. So Paris and London competed with each other for the right to host it, and each respective city had to provide certain requirements for safety and capacity for visitors. London eventually won the bid to host the event, and preparations began years in advance. The Olympics themselves are seen as representative of diversity, competition, and global unity. Almost all nations are welcome to compete, and citizens from their countries are expected to be welcomed and to feel safe. As the Olympics are a multi-sport event, various venues and places for people to compete are needed. So the police and the local London authorities are required to provide security and organization. The Olympics were seen as generally successful, with the UK finishing in fourth place, and the USA and China first and second place, respectively. There were 36 sports and over 10,000 athletes. The opening ceremony itself depicted the social history of Britain. Some of the controversies from that time were around security, as there were not enough security guards hired, and the government had to eventually place active soldiers on the street. This was controversial in that the UK has traditionally avoided placing soldiers in civilian settings, and so in peace times it is almost unheard of for soldiers to patrol the streets. Later, a larger controversy affected the UK in the form of Brexit. Before we look at Brexit, some background is required, and then we can talk about how Brexit happened. So in 1973, Britain joined the EU in what was seen as a unification of European countries in terms of trade and safety and immigration. The concepts behind the removal of barriers for trade between any member nation, and more importantly, free movement of people, was pretty unheard of globally. The idea meant that any EU citizen could move to work in any EU country without much visa restrictions or oversight. Also, a collective set of laws would be respected in terms of things like working hours, working conditions, and those kind of things. In 2016, British people were asked to vote on whether to stay as part of the EU or to leave. This vote was somewhat unexpected at the time, but there had been increasing complaints about some of the concepts behind the EU, so it was a problem in society at that time. The leader of the UK at the time, David Cameron, decided to end the complaints and kind of give the people a voice. And he did this by calling for a vote to leave the EU or not. So no one expected the result that happened. But the population voted to leave by 51% to 49%. This vote had an enormous impact on Britain. The lead up to the vote was troubled with issues on both sides. There were issues of fake reporting and fake statistics from the Leave campaign, and a lack of energy and voter turnout from the Stay campaign. The primary reasons people voted to leave the EU were as follows. The first was the economy. Some people didn't like the favorable trade with EU countries and thought economically they could get better trade deals with countries outside of the EU, countries like the USA, India, Australia, etc. The second issue was immigration. Many people assumed that EU workers and migrants were stealing the jobs that British people could have done and would have done had they not been there. So many of the EU migrants were from poorer EU countries, and they would work in many of the kind of lower level jobs. The third issue was sovereignty. So some people felt swallowed by the EU, and they didn't really want to be part of a collective. They desired a strong, independent Britain as they had in the past. The consequences of the Brexit vote were immediate, and the leader, David Cameron, stepped down as leader. The legal and administrative process of leaving Europe was enormous, and it took until 2020 until Britain officially left the EU. So many of the complications came from the border between the Republic of Ireland, which is a country not part of Britain, and Northern Ireland, which is a part of Britain and a part of the UK. They share a border, and it was difficult to agree on how trade goods would be checked, how they would police the border, and who could travel between each of the two countries. So this was further problematic by the history of Ireland, with some people wanting unification between the two countries. Another complication was the status of people who already lived in the EU, lived in EU countries that were not their own. So, for example, if a Polish person had lived in the UK at the time of Brexit, they would ask themselves, can we stay there afterwards? How long can we stay for? Do I have to go back to my mother country? So these were kind of issues that didn't really have easy answers. The UK also had to pay a penalty to leave the EU, and financially, this was a lot of money. How much money exactly took a long time for the EU and the UK to agree on. The legacy of Brexit created divides still seen today. The majority of Leave voters were older, and the younger generation felt somewhat betrayed by the vote to leave by parents or grandparents. And this created a bitter divide between some families and generations of people. The effects on Britain since Brexit are really clearly negative. The economy has declined. There are many jobs that are absent workers because many of those workers were from the EU countries. Many of the leaders of the Leave campaign are not even in politics anymore, and some don't even live in the UK. So overall, we can say support for Brexit has declined these days.